And away we go. Thanks
Uh,
for joining us, everyone. My name's Jasper with Score Maine. I'm joined, unless, Brian, are you ready to go?
yeah, I'm ready.
Perfect. All right. Well, I'm Jasper with Score Maine. We're joined today by Brian Hanson of Maine Business Brokers, and he's also one of Score Maine's subject matter experts. If you happen to have a mentor and need advice on buying or selling your business, we bring him in for consultation on that. I do want to thank today's sponsor. I believe it is Norway Savings Bank, but let me double check.
It's Norway Savings Bank.
It is indeed Norway Savings Bank, a great partner of ours here at Score. We're big fans of theirs. And yeah, if you weren't familiar with SCORE, just a quick blurb. We're a nonprofit partner of the Small Business Administration, helping businesses from open to close. We have chapters throughout the country and three right here in Maine. And we put on presentations like this a couple times a week. And Brian, if you're ready to take it away, we can move ahead.
Great, thank you. Okay, so good morning, everyone.
I will
This
say
is
it looks like your screen share stopped if you meant to.
uh, okay. 1 second. We good there?
Yes.
Does that showing the full screen?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. All right.
Perfect.
Apologize for that, everybody. I am a Luddite at heart, so my tech skills are iffy at best. So, welcome to the basics of buying and selling a business. I'll introduce myself in a second, Brian Hanson. But I would say that this is meant to be an overview course. This was originally a 3-hour workshop that we reduced to 2 hours after COVID, and I think today we have it scheduled for an hour. So there may be questions or subjects that we won't have a lot of time to touch upon. I would encourage you, if you do have additional questions, to reach out to me or SCORE, and I'm happy to have that discussion and answer any more complicated questions. We are going to allow people to ask questions during the session. I'm going to try to address them quickly, but again, if it's something that it feels like will take more time or an in-depth conversation, I'd like to push it off to keep the curriculum today on our hour timeline. All right. So my name is Brian Hanson. I'm the president of Maine Business Brokers, which is a Maine and New Hampshire-based M&A firm. I've owned it for going on about 20 years. I also own a number of businesses and have owned many, many businesses in Portland and New England and around the country and a few outside of the country. So I'm not just a practitioner of brokerage or business. I'm a real owner. So I'm speaking from experience as well. I've been a SCORE mentor volunteer for think over 11 years now. And I've authored a small book called Buying and Selling a Business that can be found on Amazon. So the first thing that I want to talk about that I spend a lot of time doing is managing expectations for both my clients, business owners, and for buyers that are looking to buy a business. For many people, buying or selling a business is a one-time transaction. Someone may start a business and run it their entire lives, and eventually want to retire, or there's another issue that forces them to exit, and they've never done it before. Buyers often are excited about the idea of ownership and entrepreneurship, but may not have any experience in the private sector or have never bought a business. And so a lot of times we bring our assumptions. Our assumptions are that buying a business is a lot like real estate or a similar purchase of an expensive asset like a car or something similar. So let's talk about what these expectations are. And we'll start with the buyers. Buyers come to us a lot looking for this perfect business. Certainly now in summer in Maine, we get a lot of tourists and they call me up, fall in love with the state and want a business. And sometimes they can't even articulate what that business is. You know, it's at the end of a dock overlooking the ocean, but they're excited about the prospect. So when I'm talking and working with buyers, I really want them to drill down on their search criteria. And they're probably going to need to compromise, whether it's price, the size, the type of industry, the type of business or location. You probably won't get what you consider the perfect business. Every business will have flaws or something that's not quite right. So be prepared to understand what you're willing to bend on, but what is really important to you from the search. Otherwise, you're just going to continue to look and never really find a business that will meet all of your needs. Buyers we'll look for businesses where the seller is offering significant or all seller financing. And honestly, that's a very rare occurrence. We might see that in businesses that are distressed or there's some type of emergency, but of course that leads to other issues in terms of the business being damaged or failing. So the reality is that buyers should expect to, if needed, to go to third-party financing, traditional sources like banks or others. And if they're looking for a business where the owner is going to finance the whole thing, you're going to spend a lot of time looking. We also hear a lot about buyers with an expectations that they can just put 10% down and buy a business. And while it's true, there are some lending programs that will allow for a 10% down payment, there's also other costs associated with acquiring a business. So there's closing costs, right? The cost of hiring attorneys and accountants and other professionals to get the deal done. There might be licensing fees, insurance deposits, and similar. But there's also what we call working capital, which is a certain amount of liquidity in a business that's needed to operate it, whether that's an inventory purchase or it's money that's needed to basically cover accounts receivable terms or shortfalls in seasonality. That's important. And some businesses could have significant working capital requirements and others not so much. But we generally say about a third of the deal price is probably needed in cash for a buyer to acquire a business. And the idea that you, for $100,000, you can just buy $1 million business is probably unlikely. Sometimes buyers come to me looking for a passive investment or just to buy a business and run it from afar, or they're looking for a business with management in place. But unless we're talking about very large businesses, 5 million and above, most small businesses, what we call Main Street businesses, is owner operated. And the idea that you can run a small business remotely is difficult to do. Now, there's some types of businesses that may seem more able to be run passively. I hear a lot about laundromats and car washes, but even those businesses require some level of input. So I really want buyers to understand that if they have a full-time job and they're hoping to buy a small business as sort of a supplementary income or a passive investment, there's a lot of risks to trying to do that remotely or passively. Process time. From a buyer standpoint, buying a business, when you find something that meets your requirements and you've negotiated a deal, it can still take 3 to 6 months to close on it. It's not a quick process, especially if banks are involved. A lot of times buyers are working full time, so they're basically putting together all the work they're doing nights, weekends, and lunch hours. So it's not a quick process. There's a lot of hurdles in the way that we'll talk about. So be prepared for that time commitment. If you're looking to buy a business and acquire it in 30 days, it's probably going to be very difficult unless there's a lot of factors already in place. And then finally, buyers seem to be nervous of businesses that have competition. And I often hear like, well, I really like the business, but I think there's too much competition or this person is competing with it. But the reality is that almost every business is living in a competitive environment. And in my personal belief, I would rather buy a business where I have known competition rather than a business that has no competition because it might be an early adopter or a new business, because eventually someone will come in and compete with you. So for me, I'm more comfortable with a known landscape than buying something where I know there'll be a lot of copycats later, or that there'll be other businesses entering. That was true in the marijuana industry, where we saw a couple first movers, and obviously now we're seeing a flood of copycats in the market and additional businesses, and it's been saturated. So just a few items from the buyer expectations. Let's talk about the seller expectations. So sellers always tell me that the perfect buyer is a wealthy couple from New York that will come in and write them a check. That doesn't happen generally. It's nice if someone just shows up and drops the cash off in the front yard, but it's never really that smooth or quick. And the reality is there's a compromise. You might get the perfect buyer that has a great skill set that a business owner really sees as taking their business to the next level, or being a good steward for the business they've built their whole lives, but they may not be fully financially capable of making the acquisition. Or they might find a highly financially viable buyer who has a very sharp pencil, tough to negotiate, and difficult to deal with. Somewhere, again, there will be a compromise. Sellers always tell me they don't want to offer any seller financing, but the reality is that they'll probably need to offer 10 to 20% in seller financing to get a deal closed. The banks like to see sellers offer seller financing. It shares risk, and it also shows confidence in their business that they're willing to hold the paper on it to a potential buyer. Sellers want to see risk-tolerant buyers. Small businesses are inherently risky. And if the buyer is seeing every aspect of the business as a potential risk or concern or worry, it could be that they just don't have the risk tolerance to own a small business, or they're so hesitant and cautious they just won't get to a closing. Many of my clients think their businesses are worth millions or need millions to retire and to sell. And we're going to talk about valuation a little bit later in this workshop. But the reality is the business's value is based on its earnings, but ultimately a business is worth what someone is willing to pay for it in the end. Okay. Sellers want a quick process. Once they've decided to sell, they want to get out quick. They want to retire or move on to their next adventure or a challenge. But from a seller perspective, selling a business can take 9 to 12 months or even 18 months. And certain businesses can take years to sell. It's not like real estate where a listing goes on the market on Friday and all offers are in by Sunday and it's under contract on Monday. It just does not work that way. And we measure things in months and quarters and sometimes in years. It is a slow, deliberative process. Obviously, when a business owner wants to sell, they're ready to retire or to fund their next endeavor. But what we encourage sellers to do is truly understand the tax consequences of the sale and closing costs, so they understand what their net proceeds are and not just get excited about the potential sale price of their business. I've never had a seller not be surprised by the tax hit they take on selling. It's a real thing. There are taxes owed on the sale of business, and we encourage clients, once they understand where their business value might range from, to talk to their accountant, tax attorney to truly understand what they would look like in terms of tax payments after the closing. Sellers, again, they understand the issues of competition, but if they are long-term business owners, they know that it's just part of doing business. And so they also get frustrated when buyers seem to be concerned about competition. And then finally, I would say that almost every business owner feels very strongly about their business. They have an emotional investment into it. Sometimes it represents a life's work. So obviously they feel it's a fantastic business and a great opportunity for someone. But the reality is that some businesses just aren't saleable. They may be obsolete business models. They may be in a geographic area of Maine that isn't as interesting or attractive to buyers. That they could have deferred maintenance or other issues. It could be just a change in the landscape. There's a lot of reasons why a business wouldn't be saleable. And it's tough news for a business owner to hear, but we encourage people to understand how to value their business, the factors around the saleability of the business, so they can plan ahead, because there might be things they can do to prepare their business for sale to make it more attractive or more saleable. So let's talk about the preliminary search. From buyer and seller standpoint, first of all, these are confidential processes. For those of you that have looked online and are looking for businesses, you'll probably notice that most of the ads are blind, meaning they're very vague and general descriptions about the business, sometimes confusingly so. But sellers need to keep the sale confidential. They don't want the disruption to their clients, to their staff, to their vendors. They don't want the rumor mill running. It's just distraction. And unfortunately, some businesses lose that confidentiality and it could impact it. But for the most part, sellers require confidentiality. So buyers will need to sign a non-disclosure agreement or a confidentiality agreement and understand that discretion is critical out of respect for that seller and out of respect for the process. From a disclosure standpoint, The buyer at some point will also need to disclose their own finances. It's important that the seller or the representative, a broker, understands that the buyer is financially capable of making that acquisition. And I've had buyers say, I'm not sharing anything with you. And that's a very difficult step to get over. But at some point, a buyer will probably be required to show some means or ability to make the acquisition. At the same time, business owners have to share financials at some point with the buyer. Now, there is a process we'll talk about in just a second quickly, and we'll get more into it later in this workshop. But sellers need to be able to procure timely and accurate financial and business reports for the buyer. And then if the business goes under contract, maybe for banks and other people that are part of the deal. So it's very important that sellers understand that they have to share certain financial information and ultimately all of their financial information to get a deal done. So there is an orderly process that we use for selling a business, and we're going to go through the steps in a little bit. And that process is a step-by-step approach, where as the buyer gets more involved and more committed to the process, they get access to more information, proprietary information, and confidential information. And from the seller side, that means they need to be prepared to respond to timely requests for information, and again, to have accurate information to present to them. So what are the basic search criteria? Buyers, I encourage to really create a list of elements of the business that are interesting or appealing to them. What type of work is it? What are the hours? How does it impact their work-life balance or their lifestyle needs or their family demands? What are their skill sets? How does this business meet those? Those are all important. If we are just looking at buying a business based purely on income or how much money you're going to earn, you may end up acquiring a business that you don't enjoy, that your skill sets are not well suited for. And once you're in that, it's very difficult to get out of it. You can't just buy a business and 2 weeks later, get a money back guarantee or return it to the seller. You have to stick in it and run it for a while. And seeing buyers buy a business that aren't a good fit for them is very frustrating to see, because they're trapped and they're not happy. And then from the seller side, what is appealing about your business? It's not just if it's very profitable, it's what are the elements of the business that make it saleable, that appeal to the buyer, and what might that buyer look like? What would be the perfect buyer? Not just, again, a New York couple that have high net worth, but what would be the person that could come in that would replace you and fill your shoes? The second key criteria is cash flow. And we'll use this word interchangeably with profitability and earnings and other phrases. But basically, a buyer needs to find a business that is going to generate income to replace their income needs. So if they need to earn $75,000 a year, they can't look at businesses that are only cash flowing 50,000, and they really can't even look at a business that's cash flowing 75,000, because that's the maximum cash flow of the business. If you borrow money, you're going to need additional funds to pay P&I, principal and interest. And you probably want to set some money aside for reserves, for capital expenditures or unknown expenses or growth. So for someone that's looking for an income of, let's say, $100,000, you probably need to look at businesses that are cash flowing $150,000 or maybe $150,000 to $200,000. So don't waste time looking at businesses that won't meet your income needs. Your rent or mortgage doesn't go away, car payments don't go away, tuition doesn't go away, insurance and all of your life expenses don't go away just because you bought a business. And then on the seller side, again, we understand that the cash flow, the profitability of your business ultimately drives what your sale price will be. And while there may be a lot of emotional value and emotional baggage that you've had in the business, a buyer's not going to pay for that. Telling a buyer that your business, has had, impacts on your health and it's cost you a lot personally, and you really need to get a good sale price to make up for that. That's not a compelling argument. So buyers are not going to pay for that emotional value. And then finally, location. Certainly, Maine is a small state, but there are many attractive factors on why buyers outside of the state want to move here. But within the state, we all know that there's certain areas that are more attractive than others. And sometimes that is a lifestyle attraction like living on the coast. And other times it's the business needs to be in a market with enough customers. And so that's really southern Maine versus the less populated areas of northern Maine or down east. And so location does matter. Now, some businesses are virtual or e-commerce companies, and they're not impacted by that. But if you have a business that's located north of Augusta or down east or in the county, they can be much more difficult to sell. They may take much longer to sell, or they may not be able to get full value because of that location that will have a discount on the value. And if you're a buyer looking at businesses, be realistic about where you're looking. There's so many businesses for sale online. You can look all day long, but be realistic. It's not realistic to commute 2 hours a day. You're probably not going to get your family to relocate. And we know that with the housing market, selling a home where you live now to buy a home somewhere else, even within the state, could be problematic. So if it's a bricks and mortar or a location-based business here in Maine, you want to live in a reasonable distance from it, especially as the owner, where you probably want to be able to react to any issues. So location is important. So when buyers start their search and start finding businesses, they typically ask a number of questions. These are the ones that I see quite often. And these are the questions they ask, but they probably shouldn't bother asking. And the first question is, how long has the business been on the market? Now, in real estate, if it's been on the market more than 8 weeks, people get concerned. There must be something wrong with the house. It hasn't passed an inspection. And so when they ask how long a business has been for sale, and I tell them 8 weeks, and they're like, that long, they make those same assumptions that they would about real estate. But again, if it takes 6 to 9 months to sell a business, then time is less of an issue. And really, time on market for a business is a really poor indicator of any real information. But the second question that's related is, why are they selling? Well, I don't ask people why they're selling a car, and I generally don't ask people why they're selling a house. But for some reason, buyers ask, why is the seller or the business owner selling? And I think both these questions, how long has it been on the market and why are they selling, is the buyer asking a different question in a nicer way. And that is, what's wrong with the business, right? What is wrong with it? Because in their mind, if someone's selling their business that's profitable, why would they do that? Or if it's been on the market for 6 weeks, then other buyers must have already examined it and passed. So there's sort of this implied idea that it's been on the market a long time, or they're selling because there's something wrong. Now, there are ways that buyers can protect themselves from defects in the business. Defects could be physical defects or cash flow or operational defects. But also the process of buying a business is intense. It requires deep due diligence, and it's incredibly rare for a seller to slip and hide something away that the buyer will not see during the process. So I want buyers to understand that there will be time and a place for them to really examine the business and look at all of its flaws and look at all of its positive attributes, and not to be worried about that at the outset. The fourth question they ask is, send me the tax returns. We don't do that generally. First of all, tax returns are very poor documents for information about a business, right? The purpose of a tax return is to make the business look as least profitable as possible. So in some ways, it's doing the antithesis of what you need, right? If your accountant's doing a good job, they're showing your business at its lowest profitability possible. And tax returns tend to clump costs together and don't show seasonality or monthly sales. So we tend to prepackage financials based on profit and loss statements, which are much more granular. And we'll talk about that in a second. And then finally, buyers ask, when can I have a showing, or when can I walk through the business? So these sales are confidential. So unless the business is open to the public, we don't do showings right away. Many times it's not even important. So if a buyer gets to the point where there's an agreed upon value, we can get it under contract through a LOI, which we'll talk about in a little while, then there will be a time and a place for an on-site visit. But initially, that is less important. I just tell people, if it's open to the public, go in anonymously as a customer and just check it out. And that will give you a lot of ideas about how the operation works. So if those are questions they shouldn't ask, What are the questions they should? Three simple questions. What's for sale? I don't know if in the last 5 years anybody's even asked me that. Now, it's assumed that the business is for sale, but I'm being more specific. What is included in the sale? You know, the assets, licenses, patents, trade lists, recipes. Is the real estate included? Is it for lease? All of those things should be disclosed at the outset. And sometimes it's small things that are excluded. I had a business that I sold, and the entire interior of the business was a collection of personal artwork that was not going to be included in the sale. The buyer had to replace all of that, and it cost about $30,000 to replace all of those decorations and artwork. Sometimes the business vehicle that runs errands or plows the driveway or the parking lot, that's the owner's personal truck and would not be conveyed in the sale. Sometimes personal computers and other things might be kept by the seller. So we want to make sure that it's very clear what assets, and those assets can be tangible, like a desk or a computer, or intangible, like a website or a trade name, what is included in the sale. Because you do not want to get a couple weeks away from buying a business and find out that there's a number of critical elements that are not being included. That should have been disclosed early. So what's for sale? Two, a buyer should be able to ask, how did you get to this price and value? And a seller's response can't be, well, that's what I want. So if they're using a broker or an intermediary, or they're selling it by themselves, they should be able to explain how the value is calculated. And in the end, the business price has to meet, or how should I say it? A buyer should be able to purchase the business and finance it, and the business should have enough cash flow to service the debt and compensate the buyer. It's as simple as that. But there's obviously a lot more complicated methodologies. We're not going to dive into too much valuation today, because it's just a subject that takes too much time, and we're sort of outside the scope. And then the third question is, well, what information is available? If you're not going to give me tax returns, what can you provide me? And that is a good, valid question. And what they're going to provide is basic due diligence. A seller, a business owner, needs to be prepared to provide this information to a potential buyer. Profit and loss for the last 3 years. Doesn't need to be by the week or day, maybe even a month, unless there's some real seasonality that should be shown, like a toy store that sells everything in Q4, or a seasonal business that's only open during the summer. But a profit and loss for 3 years, depending on where we are in the current year, a current year to date with a year-over-year comparison. So we don't generally do that in January, maybe not February. Now that we're in June, we start showing year-to-dates. A customer product mix or concentration. So what is selling and who it's selling to, but more importantly, is there any concentrations? Does a single product make up the predominance of the sales, or does a single customer account for 10, 20, or 30% of all the sales? Because that's a risk factor. A buyer needs to know that the primary customer is also, it might be a relative or personal friend of the current owner. And how does that relationship change if there's a change of ownership? If there's real estate that's included in the sale, or if there's a lease, those details need to be included. And then basic employee info. Who does what? Are they hourly or salary? What do they get paid? What's the basic schedule? How does the buyer get their arms around how this business operates? We don't have to show complete payroll records, social security numbers, but just a general idea of the staffing and what these people's job roles are and what they are compensated to do so. And that is all the information generally that is needed for a buyer to say, this is the business I'm interested in. I think I want to make an offer, but more importantly, they should be able to form an opinion of value to make an offer. Now, later, there will be a lot more information exchanged between buyer and seller, but this is the basics and the minimums. And if you are a buyer and you are unable to get this type of information, it's outdated, or they just are unwilling to share it with you, then you turn and walk, period. Doesn't matter how much you love the business. That is not a good sign for all sorts of reasons. And if you are a seller, understand that this is a minimum level. If you are choosing to sell your business, you are committing to a certain responsibility, and you need to be able to provide this level of information at first, and then later, much more in-depth information. All right. So we're going to talk very quickly about valuation, and this will not be enough, and I apologize. But again, based on the time we have today, um, this is about as much as I can dive into it. So let's talk about some basic concepts and terms. Businesses can have up to three components of value. All right. The real estate, if real estate is included in the sale, inventory, if the business has some type of inventory, like a retail store or something similar, and then the business itself. Each one of those has a different method of valuation. Real estate is valued, that's a whole, I mean, that's a subject, it's a whole college curriculum, how to value commercial real estate. Inventory is valued at cost, but there can be some adjustments, and businesses are valued based on their cash flow. And so what we want to do is break out those components, if they're there, and value them separately. And sometimes when we look online, we see a business for sale with a single price, and it includes all of these. It includes real estate. You know, price includes real estate and price includes inventory. Well, that can actually hide mispricing. So it's very difficult to tell if it's a good value or not. And it's not very informative. So when we value businesses, we are valuing each element discreetly. Item number two, the seller keeps their cash in their bank account and they keep receivables. Those are not included in the sale unless they come to an agreement to buy them for some reason. Seems silly to sell someone $10,000 of cash for anything less than $10,000. To me, it seems a wash. Receivables are monies that the business owner has not received, but for services or goods they've already delivered. So that they keep that. Now, there are some situations where a buyer will buy the receivables because they're aged out or something similar. But generally, those are cash and cash equivalents are kept by the seller. The third term here is what we call owner discretionary expenses. That is a polite way of saying costs that small business owners run through their business that aren't really business related. Personal cell phones for your family, a small trip to Key West, a fishing boat, a helicopter. I've seen, you know, personal health insurance. Owning a small business is risky, and there's a little bit of a gray area there where one of the benefits might be running through some expenses that are not business related to expense it off to reduce your taxable income. However, those are distorting the business performance. The seller is doing that for the tax benefit, but it's making the business look less profitable. The buyer needs to really see a picture of the business in the clearest form, right? And so these distortions are disrupting that. So it's incumbent upon a seller to identify the costs they're running through the business that aren't really business related. And for the buyer, they really need to understand what the business truly looks like in terms of profitability. So we want to identify those owner discretionary expenses. And ultimately, we're trying to get to this number we call EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, or amortization, plus owner benefits. So the owner benefits could be salary or pay, but also all of those other owner discretionary things. They're paying their personal car, lease payment through the business, all these other things that they do. And that number is really what the business generates in income to a potential buyer. And there might be further adjustments we have to make, but we're going to talk about that too. And then we're going to talk about the asset versus the stock sale. So 99% of businesses now are structured as an asset sale. So we all kind of think of when you buy a business, you're buying its stock. Most businesses don't even issue stock anymore. LLCs, S corps, they don't actually have stock. They have either membership percentages or ownership by member, by pro rata, right? So the idea of stock receipts or stock certificates is sort of something from a bygone era. But that's really not the issue. Businesses are sold as asset sales in this way. The buyer forms a new company, right? So they go and apply for a corporate structure form based on their lawyer's recommendation of the type of business it is. They go to the state of Maine and they form a new company, or they form a company out of state, however that works. And think of that as an empty bowl. And that bowl is just a shell. And at the closing, the seller pours their stuff in their company bowl into the buyer's company bowl. That is basically what an asset sale is. Those assets are transferred free and clear. The buyer is not assuming any debt. loans, or anything else. It's purely buying these assets. And again, the assets can be something physical and tangible, like a delivery van or factory equipment, but it can also be intangible items like websites and Google ad click campaigns and customer lists and marketing know-how and trade dress and all of those other things. So the buyer is not assuming any liabilities, but the benefit of this is the buyer is taking over the business with a fresh, brand new EIN number, employee identification number. They are not assuming any past unknown liabilities from the business. I'm not talking about debt. I'm talking about tort liability. All right. In Maine, a statute of limitation on tort is 7 years. And as a buyer, if you buy the stock of the business, the corporate entity, you are buying 7 years of unknown liability. And there is no reason to do that. So from a buyer's perspective, there's virtually no reason to structure the deal as a stock sale. From the seller standpoint, there are times, especially when they have their business structured as a C Corp, they need to or hope to sell as a stock sale because that gives them a tax advantage. They don't have double taxation on the sale. But again, in 20 years, I've seen 1 or 2 stock sales, and that was generally because they were in a very specific industry like defense manufacturing, where they had to contain and maintain contracts with the government. Most business sales, almost all of them, will be structured as an asset sale, period. Okay, so this is a rule of thumb valuation model. This is what we call an earnings multiple methodology. And so what we do is we calculate the earnings of the business. Sometimes we do that by averaging the last 3 years. And that earnings here on this formula is EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, plus owner's salary and benefits. And that gets us to earnings, which here is called seller discretionary earnings. Sometimes it's called discretionary cash flow. There's probably 20 different names for it. But the technical definition is EBITDA. And once we have defined that, and the seller may have one calculation where they feel their EBITDA is X number, and a buyer may do their own calculation and come up with a different earnings, probably lower. And that is part of the negotiation, the agreement and the disagreement on what the true earnings of the business are. Because the business is a going concern. It's moving, changing, and running all the time. So choosing what its earnings are, in a single moment isn't really reflective of an ongoing average. So we have to negotiate an agreed upon average earnings. From there, we find an earnings multiple. Now, in this formula, I've just got 3 as a placeholder. If we were to group all the businesses that have sold in the last 20 years under $5 million, what we call Main Street business or small businesses, the average multiple for all of those businesses is 2.4. And generally, businesses sell between 2 and 3 multiple of earnings. Okay. Now, that surprises a lot of people. I have business owners say, well, then I could run my business for 2.4 more years and get that and then close it, and I would be in the same place. That is right. That is absolutely correct. It is a hamster wheel. Multiples are multiples, earnings are earnings. So the only way to increase the value of your business is to add something interesting to it that might provide a premium or to get your earnings up. It's as simple as that. And then once we have the value of the business, we also value the inventory if that's applicable, and we value the real estate if that's applicable, and that gets us to the total enterprise value. So right there was a 2-minute summary of a 3-hour class. But again, based on time, and I'm happy to have more in-depth discussions with people about that. But this is a very simple rule of thumb value methodology. There are much more complicated ones we can do with discounted cash flows or option arbitrage models. But for this will get you in the ballpark of the business value. It might not be entirely accurate, but it's probably going to be within 10% of what someone would consider a much more robust valuation process. Okay. So what can also change the value of the business than just earnings? And that's what we call value drivers. So attractive or interesting work. Certainly people are buying businesses based on lifestyle needs, right? So something that might tie into the Maine tourism industry, bike rentals in the summer, or kayaks or tours. Some of those things might be interesting to someone. Strong market position, being a dominant player in the field, having a proprietary technology, right? Intellectual property, a patent, that can help. Location. It is certainly true that if you take two businesses that are identical, one of them that is in southern Maine and one of them is in northern Maine, the one in southern Maine will sell for more money. It's as simple as that. It's just there's more buyers that want to be in the southern Maine market. Strong operating systems, right? So buyers do not want to come in to a chaotic business. They want to come into a business that is well run with good policies and procedures and good operational systems. Proven stability helps. So a business that isn't wild swings in earnings, revenue, or even profitability. Good books and records, obviously. So we have timely reports that are accurate, and reasonable terms. Now, I don't mean to just imply a low price, but just a seller that's reasonable is willing to offer some seller financing and is reasonable about training the new owner and being there for them in a support capacity and having a price that makes sense. So all of those things can provide a boost to the value of the business. It's not going to boost it up to a 3 or 4 multiple automatically, but you can get a business that might normally sell for a 2.5 multiple on earnings to 2.6, 2.7, 2.8. Certain businesses, iconic businesses, certainly might sell for an unrealistic price. There is not a summer that goes by that someone doesn't ask me if they can buy, Red's up in Wiscasset or Red's Dairy Treats in South Portland or something similar. Of course, those businesses don't go to market. All right. So to get to the earnings, we need to recast the financials for a new owner, meaning oftentimes the profit and loss statement will be distorted by all sorts of things. What could those be? Well, sometimes they are husband and wife or partners working in the business, and they're taking a single salary, but they're doing the work of 2 people. So we want to assume that a new owner is one person and we cast back to a single owner. That means if there are more family members that are working and not being compensated at market value, that has to be adjusted for. We want to look at expenses that aren't there. Maybe cousin, Bill is plowing the parking lot in the wintertime and has done that for free because he has a truck and all of that. And maybe does that for some gift cards or something. We want to adjust for that. That's cousin Bill's probably not going to do that for the new owner. We want to make sure there's no bartering or swapping going on that behind the scenes, for advertising, for gift cards. We see all sorts of things in Maine. It's not uncommon, but we want to understand how this business actually looks for the new owner. Will the rent change for the new owner, whether the seller owns the real estate or there's a third-party landlord? What will the rent or lease look like for the new buyer? So we want to normalize that. And are there these discretionary expenses we talked about? Is the owner running through a lot of personal expenses through the business? It's fine if they do. The buyer can do the same, but it's non-business related. And so it's reducing the performance of the business. And so it benefits the seller to disclose those items, and it helps the buyer understand what the business truly looks like and how it performs. And by going through these profit and losses, we clean them up. And again, sometimes we use a 3-year average. We look at the last 3 years and we get an average cash flow. And that is a baseline for us. Come up with a value of the business and make an offer. Okay. So the final piece is negotiations. And there are multiple parts of this process that need to be negotiated. There's usually 2 or 3 negotiating points. The first one is the LOI, or what we call the letter of intent. It could also be called a term sheet or a memorandum of understanding or a number of different names. And it's basically the basic principles that both buyer and seller are agreeing to. The price, there's an allocation process that has to do with taxes, a target closing date, post-closing items, all of these, we try to put as much detail in as possible, but it basically says the buyer and seller are agreeing in principle. And we memorialize that in a document because the buyer needs that document to go to a bank and say, I have the right, I've come to an agreement to purchase this business, and this proves that. The term sheet might also have contingencies. This is contingent upon the buyer obtaining financing. It's contingent upon the third-party landlord giving approval to transfer the lease or to negotiate a new one. There might be licenses that have to be acquired by the buyer. So there are some contingencies for most businesses that need to be met. There's generally a deposit, a good faith deposit, where the buyer says, I'm going to put money into this, and this is showing my commitment to the process. But it's generally not a non-refundable deposit, but we like to tie it to performance. And we'll talk about it in a second. So for businesses of maybe up to $500,000, generally we're looking at deposits of $5,000 or $10,000. From $500,000 to $1 million, it might be 10,000, 15, and then for deals that are 2, 3, 5, $10 million, we're seeing much larger, $50,000, $100,000 deposits. But people ask me all the time, what's a reasonable deposit? And it's, $5,000, $10,000 for most of these Main Street style businesses. The buyer may ask for exclusivity, or what we call a no shop clause. And basically what's going on here is the buyer and seller have come to an agreement, and now the buyer has a lot of work to do, right? They have to go through due diligence and apply for licensing and going to banks and all of that. So what they're saying is, while I'm putting all of this together, I don't want you to take my offer and shop it to other interested buyers to try to get 10% more. That throws me under the bus and it's not fair. That is a reasonable request. But the seller also has a reasonable position, and that is if they take the business off the market for a period of time, then that costs them too. Because if the buyer doesn't execute on the purchase, they've lost valuable market time. So generally, we agree to some portion of the deposit becomes non-refundable in exchange for a reasonable exclusivity period. That's generally 4 to 6, maybe 8 weeks. That gives the buyer enough time to meet with banks and really get a sense that they can put the deal together. And once we have all of that in place, we sign it, we have an LOI, and we move on to next steps. The next step is now what we call full due diligence. So earlier we talked about basic due diligence, but now that we have an agreement, this is when the buyer is entitled to all or almost all proprietary information about the business. They need to see tax returns so they can verify the profit and loss. They want to see insurance policy binders, complete payroll records, probably detailed sales or access to a POS system. This is when they're getting their arms around the details of the business. And this is also information that the bank or financing source will probably need, or some parts of that. So there's a lot of work on the buyers there. They're trying to maybe give a notice at work or prepare for leaving a current job or position. So they're working. They have to go to banks if they're looking for financing. They're trying to get through all this due diligence. They're clearing up any personal issues they might need to do, and they're trying to learn about the business. So it's very important and incumbent upon a seller to be responsive when there is a due diligence request that comes in. The buyer says, I need this information. Then the seller really needs to be prepared, because if they drag it out or say, well, I only do my accounting once every 3 months, they're probably going to lose the deal. So again, there is a responsibility that a seller commits to when they agree to sell their business. And that commitment is to the process. And buyers have a lot of balls are juggling in the air, and there's clock running. And so we need to be sure that we're responsive to that. Here I've got highlighted third-party consents that I touched upon. So there are third parties in these deals, not the buyer, not the seller, that can either make or break getting to a closing. Landlords are a good example of them. Certainly in Portland, landlords have now what we call a significant change of ownership clause in their leases that basically says the lease isn't really transferable. If there's a change of ownership, I now have the right to renegotiate the lease. Well, we're seeing in Portland where leases could double, and that may make the whole deal impossible to put together. But there's other third-party consents. There might be leasing companies that lease fleet vehicles, or printers, or certainly licensing authorities are third-party consents. So the buyer needs to tackle those items to make sure that they're not going to just spin their wheels or waste everybody's time, because the landlord won't be reasonable on terms, or the lease isn't transferable, or there's licensing hurdles, or the building has city and code issues that can't be met. So there's a number of different things that we want to work through. So while we're doing that, we have an LOI executed and we're getting through deep due diligence or full due diligence. we're drafting a purchase and sale agreement. This is the definitive document that covers the actual transaction, the bill of sale, if you will. But there's also supporting schedules that cover all the different parts of the deal. Now, we want as much detail in the LOI as possible, because that is what's driving, that is sort of how we're building the purchase and sale, and the attorneys are drafting off of. So the more details that are agreed to earlier, the easier it is. Because we don't want is attorneys spending a lot of time renegotiating items or having to negotiate items that weren't addressed properly to begin with. Okay. The purchase and sale can be executed before the closing or in the day of closing, but once it's executed, barring some significant contingency like the end of the world or something, it's generally a locked-in deal. But one of the parts of the purchase and sale agreement that are important that I want to draw attention to is what we call reps and warranties. Now, representations and warranties are made by both buyer and seller, but mostly the burden is on the seller. And these representations or assertions made by both parties, promises or statements of fact. And this is what protects buyers and sellers from fraud or misstatements or non-disclosure of material facts. Excuse me. Now, these representations are not, this business is going to guarantee to succeed. They're not, you're going to be a millionaire. Those aren't the kind of representations they are. These are representations like, I'm not currently being sued, or I haven't dumped gallons of toxic waste in the back, or I have paid all of my taxes. There's no liens against the business for criminal processes, all those types of things. I own everything that I'm actually selling you. It's not owned by other people. Those are the kind of reps that are made. The buyer makes a few reps themselves, but generally it's seller based. The warranty part of it is what happens if a representation is breached. And generally that's defined by two things, time and damages. So from the buyer side, they want warranties to be unlimited in perpetuity, and the seller attorney wants warranties to last 1 day or 7 days. Generally, it's usually about 6 to 9 months that we allow warranties. That gives enough time for any problems to manifest itself after the buyer takes over the business. And then the damages side of it, we typically, after negotiations, about half the value of the deal. And that is not to say that if someone breaches a rep, they're automatically entitled to half the value of the deal. It's just a cap on damages, and it allows the person in breach to correct the problem at their cost. But it creates a process for which the buyer and seller are protecting themselves against unknown items that might have been missed or intentional fraud or misrepresentation. And so that's why it's incumbent upon both buyer and seller to use good attorneys. This is not a document that you're going to download off LegalZoom and fill in the blanks. This is critical to use competent attorneys that have practiced in business law and in business transactions. Because this document is going to define everything, and a sloppily written purchase and sale agreement can create problems downstream when there's a dispute and it goes to court. And those kind of disputes can destroy a business. The legal costs alone could put someone under. So we want this to be a well-executed document for both buyer and seller. Financing, I'm going to talk quickly about this, but people ask. So third-party financing, let's just talk about banks. There's no pre-approval to buy a business. There are some people and there's some lending institutions that will tell you, they'll give you a commitment letter, but all that commitment letter really says is, we'd be happy to lend to you based on the business you buy and our further analysis of the opportunity. It is not a promise, a guaranteed promise. Ultimately, the lending decision is really based on the strength of the buyer, right? It's almost like a personal loan that's collateralized by the assets and cash flow of the business. The bank will probably try to cross-collateralize the buyer's personal assets as well, whether it's a house or something else. We encourage buyers to apply to multiple banks. I prefer regionals or super regional banks that truly understand the Maine, New Hampshire markets, and not large national banks that may seem like they have more services and abilities, but really don't truly understand the business, or the loan decision is made out of state somewhere. And there's also SBA loan guarantees. So sometimes buyers hear that the SBA provides 90% financing, and so their assumption is that if they come up with 10% down, they can purchase a business. That is not what the SBA does. The SBA is a loan guarantor. What they're willing to do is guarantee 90% of the loan amount. So if banks are willing to lend 80%, LTV, we call it, loan to value, the SBA will guarantee 90% of that 80%. So that is not a 10% down and you buy a business situation. Their SBA is offering a variety of programs based on funding and other macroeconomic issues. Sometimes they have minority programs for minority buyers, sometimes for women buyers. There's all sorts of things. There are resources like SCORE and other institutions can help buyers negotiate the lending process. So we encourage people to look into that. And then from seller financing, as I discussed, sellers probably should be prepared to offer 10 or 15, maybe 20% in seller financing. That seller financing could be either a fixed note, so a set amount of the value, or it could be structured as what we call an earnout. And an earnout is a seller note that is based on future performance. So if the business does better based on some benchmark of revenue or profitability, then the buyer pays more. But if the business doesn't perform as well, then the buyer would pay less. It's a shared risk of buyer and seller. And sometimes this can be a good solution for businesses that are volatile or in an uncertain economy, or if we don't know what will happen when the current business owner founder leaves, will that have a material impact on the business? And we don't know. And if the seller says, oh, don't worry, when I leave, all your customers will stay with you, the buyer will say, well, put your money where your mouth is. Let's structure some of this as an earnout. So if the customers do stay, you're going to get paid. And finally, sellers tell me they don't want to do seller financing because they feel like it's a handshake deal, and it is not. Seller financing is structured as a debt instrument, a legal debt instrument, and is usually backed by personal guarantee if you can't get any physical collateral. So it's not, I hope I get paid. It is a debt like anything else. There's other ancillary agreements that need to be addressed: non-competes, leases, consulting and employment if the current owner stays on. And then if there are seller financing, either as an earnout or others, there needs to be a promissory note agreed to. These need to be negotiated. There's points to it. And then they need to be formalized in documents, and they are included in the purchase and sale agreement. So, process overview. If you're a buyer, your goal is to find the right business. If you are a seller, obviously, it's to find the right buyer. There's a basic due diligence step where the seller provides those basics that we talked about, and the buyer analyzes them to determine if they want to take the next step and try to acquire the business. From there, we negotiate a purchase and sale agreement and start due diligence. The buyer is looking for financing, setting up licensing, chart of accounts for accounting, doing all of the things they need to do to prepare to take over the business. We execute the purchase and sale agreement and all the ancillary documents, promissory notes, and non-competes, and we have a closing where all those assets are transferred free and clear in an asset sale, and the buyer takes over. And at that point, typically the seller provides a reasonable level of training to make sure that the buyer knows what they're doing. And we have some post-closing adjustments if there's transfers of inventory or utilities or similar items. So that is the process and basics. Again, this was originally a 3-hour workshop, so I know I skipped over some details, but that is the 1-hour workshop for today. So I think there was some comments and questions, and I apologize because I was just trying to get through the material, but I'm certainly able to stay on as long as anybody wants to answer questions that you might have.
Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to utilize the raise hand function on the React window at the bottom of your screen, or put it in the chat. Apologize, there was a little bit of spam there. I think that person may have been thinking they had their text box in Google instead of here. But anyway, Lynn was wondering if you have any, I would say now, quick tips on a large business selling, such as 25 million plus.
Well, so there's certainly a lot of resources at that level. That's in what we call the middle market. So the middle market is probably 10 million to 250 million. And it's sort of defined by low middle market, middle market, and upper middle market. They sort of break it down into 3 areas. That is the world of investment banking. And so generally those transactions are done The intermediary tends to be the investment banker, and then financing tends to be institutional lenders or family offices or private equity money. So it's a much more complicated, but at the same time, a much more organized process. It's not as sort of messy and complicated that you can get in smaller deals because all the players are highly sophisticated and experienced transaction intermediaries. I'm not sure if that answers your question in detail, but I'm happy to delve into that a little bit more.
Yeah, and if there are any questions that people come up with later, I will say that I'll be following up with an email here with a recording of today as well as the slides for you to review at your leisure. And if you have any further questions, you can either reach out or well, questions that maybe you don't think of right now while we're still on, or they're a little too in-depth for now. It's a great time to submit a mentor request with score.org. You just enter your zip code and a little bit of information about what you're looking for help with. And Lynn does say the seminar was very thorough and thanks you for the presentation.
Oh, well, thank you everybody for attending.
Yeah, if anyone else has any questions before we wrap up, now's the great time. I'll do one last little plug. Well, if you're still typing or thinking, we are, as I said earlier, SCORE is a nonprofit partner of the Small Business Administration. We help businesses across the country from open to close. You can find a mentor, like I just said, on score.org. And here in Maine, we have helped start last year over 560 new businesses. Oh, and that's a number that we're pretty proud of. Jessica, you got your hand up.
Yes, hi. I'm wondering if you all have a a webinar or anything that you recommend for learning a little bit more about what business would use a fixed note versus earnout.
Hmm. That's a great question. I know we do have quite a number of recorded resources and webinars on our YouTube channel. When I send out the recording, the channel there might have something of your interest. That may also be a great question to submit a mentor request if you don't already have one for.
Yeah, I don't mind jumping in and just quickly. So there's no defined rules on when fixed notes or earnouts are used. It's really a part of the negotiation. Sometimes the buyer or the seller um, don't feel comfortable with an earnout because again, earnout's a shared risk. So buyers don't want to pay more, and sellers don't want to take less, even though they could potentially benefit from the opposite, paying less or paying more. It's a tool that we use in negotiations when we're trying to get to the term of the deal. Um, it might be the way to bridge a difference. And it's an earnout isn't going to be all of the price of the business. It might be a part of it. And again, it's meant to address uncertainty on both the buyer and seller part. So I would say we see earnouts in probably 1 in 5 deals, and then seller notes in 8 of 10 deals. So strict, term fixed price seller notes are much more common. I don't know if that helps.
Thank you, yeah. Can I ask one more question about that?
Sure.
Um, so I'm thinking about service businesses as opposed to product businesses. Do you have a kind of a general idea of how the valuation differs between those two?
Uh, well, that's
It's a
that's
big question.
what it is because is the service contract based? And what are those contract terms? Is it like a 1 year like for instance, landscaping companies are service based. And
Yeah.
is it residential or commercial? Is it 1 year contracts or is it at will? And so, right, so when we have contracts, we can sort of define a fixed value for the business because we know what earnings are going to be because they're locked into a contract. If it's an at-will service or a temporary service or a service without what we call reoccurring events, then it's much more hard. And then an earnout may be more appropriate for that because we don't know what earnings are because there's nothing of certainty. A person that's working on sales commissions, a car salesman, he doesn't know what his earnings are going to be ever. It's going to be a percentage of what he sells. But someone else like a gym that charges a membership, but you walk into an EFT process, they know they're getting X amount of dollars every month from those members. And there's more certainty and it's easier to predict earnings going into the future.
Okay, thank you very much.
Sure.
We have one more from Lynn in the chat. Would selling a mid-sized business to a group of family members work the same way?
Is this a all right, well, this is so selling to family members obviously brings a lot of personal elements, perhaps, to the deal that can confuse sort of what a normal arm's length transaction. The benefit to a family transaction is that you can structure the deal for real tax advantages. Now, without knowing any details, it's hard to say, but I would say to you that a close transaction like that within a family, there could be real opportunities to minimize the taxable event for all parties, and also make it more affordable for the buyers, but make it beneficial for the sellers. Does that help? I have so few facts; it's hard for me to be more specific than that.
Uh, Lynn says yes.
Okay. All
Yeah,
right.
we do
Ray,
have,
yeah, I
yeah.
see a question, advice for employees considering buying from the owner or boss. Ray, how big is the business? Can you say how many employees, or is it a large business or a small business? 20. Okay. So one option that we're seeing a lot now is ESOPs, employee stock option programs, where the seller sells to his employees. There are benefits to the seller. There's some downsides to the buyers, the employees, that I don't want to dive into right now. But if this is just a couple of employees who want to buy the business from their boss, again, there's some real advantages. You're working in the business already. You understand the business model. You probably are in a key position, whether it's management or elsewhere. So a lot of the due diligence that buyers normally undertake to learn more about the business, you don't need to do. You're right there. You're in the midst of it. The issue is what skills might be missing after the closing that your boss has, and how do you replace that? Is your boss willing to negotiate? And as employees, do you have the financial ability to make the acquisition? Just because you're employees, you can't assume that you're going to get a discount, or that he's going to provide all seller financing, because he may have some retirement needs, he or she, apologize, have retirement needs that requires him to withdraw the value of the business at closing, that he needs to get fully paid because he has to, relocate to Florida to fish, or start something else up, or pay for family members' healthcare. We don't know what that is. So if you want to buy the business, but you need substantial concessions from the owner, that might make it hard to get the deal put together. So that's sort of the give and take of it. That help? Okay. Anybody else? I'm happy if anybody wants to email me. I'm happy to answer questions, meet for coffee. I enjoy doing that. I think it's important that people are very educated on this process, because there's lots of opportunities for mistakes. And again, it's very difficult to see someone struggle and buy the wrong business. I don't like to see it. I've done it myself, and I know what it feels like. So I try to avoid that at all costs.
Yeah,
If
again, it's
that,
a,
go
yeah,
ahead.
one last plug. That's a great time to submit a mentor request to SCORE as well, since, like I said earlier, you can also be brought in on a lot of our mentoring requests, since you're one of our subject matter experts.
Great. Well, listen, thanks everybody for attending, and good luck.
Yeah, I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you all so much.